Turn off the lights and listen closely, not because something is coming for you, but because this moment needs stillness to be understood properly. There's a phrase circulating now, a dramatic way people keep trying to describe what's happening around you. They've put a number on it, 600 million. Not money, not danger, just a symbol, a way of explaining the pressure they suddenly feel when your name enters the conversation. They didn't expect this turn. They didn't expect the shift. They didn't expect people to stop reacting to noise and start watching behavior at first. Everything followed the usual pattern. Rumors moved faster than facts. Opinions formed before observation. Stories were stitched together with confidence, even when the stitching was weak. People spoke loudly, urgently, emotionally, because urgency convinces when clarity is missing. And for a while, that noise filled the space. You didn't step into it. That was the first disruption. Most people rush to correct misunderstandings. They explain themselves, they defend. They try to control perception before perception controls them. You didn't do any of that. You stayed consistent, same tone, same pace, same presence. And in a world that expects reaction, restraint feels unsettling. That's when the exaggeration began. The 600 million wasn't about value. It was about scale, about how much attention, speculation, and emotional energy people were pouring into trying to define you. When something can't be controlled, it gets inflated. When clarity refuses to perform, others dramatize around it. That number became a symbol of how badly they needed a story big enough to contain you. But exaggeration always leaves traces. You kept moving the same way you always had. No sudden shifts, no emotional spikes, no attempts to look innocent or misunderstood. You didn't posture, you didn't retreat, you didn't harden. You simply remained readable to anyone paying attention and unreadable to anyone relying on assumptions. That's when observation quietly replaced belief, not all at once. Not publicly, individually. People started noticing small inconsistencies. The claims didn't line up with the timeline. The intensity didn't match the evidence. The certainty of the accusations didn't match the instability of the people making them. Each time the narrative was repeated, it stretched a little further from reality. Each repetition demanded more belief and offered less proof. Meanwhile, you were doing nothing remarkable, and that became the most remarkable thing in the room. Your silence wasn't absence, it was continuity. Every day you stayed the same under pressure. The contrast grew sharper. Every moment you didn't react highlighted how reactive the noise actually was. Calm doesn't argue with chaos. It exposes it by existing beside it. People began comparing notes without coordinating. Quiet questions surfaced. Does this actually make sense? Have you noticed how consistent they've been? Something feels off about how this is being pushed. No one needed to organize this realization. It spread the way clarity always does, slowly, privately, irreversibly. You became a reference point without trying to be one. Your behavior became the baseline everything else was measured against. Not because you demanded it, but because consistency invites comparison. When one element stays stable, everything unstable around it becomes visible. The 600 million figure kept circling, but it started sounding theatrical, too inflated, too dramatic, like a headline that doesn't survive past the first paragraph. The more it was repeated, the more it revealed desperation rather than authority. People don't trust extremes for long. Extremes eventually reveal insecurity. And still, you didn't intervene. You didn't correct the story. You didn't challenge the exaggeration. You didn't ask anyone to take your side. You let time do what time always does when integrity stays intact. Support didn't arrive loudly, it arrived subtly. Someone choosing not to repeat a rumor, someone correcting a detail without making a scene, someone saying, "That doesn't match what I've seen," and letting the silence do the rest. No defenses, no declarations, just recognition forming naturally. The people who built the narrative felt the shift before they understood it. When exaggeration stops working, it escalates. Louder language, sharper emotion, more urgency. But escalation without new truth only accelerates collapse. Every overreaction became another data point. Every contradiction widened the gap between claim and reality. You stayed where you were, same rhythm, same posture, samey internal alignment. And that's when the meaning of the number changed. 600 million stopped sounding like pressure and started sounding like proof. Proof of how much effort it takes to distort something that refuses to bend. Proof of how much noise is required when truth isn't cooperating. What was meant to overwhelm you began overwhelming the people sustaining it. You didn't defeat the narrative. You outlasted it. Day by day, your consistency quietly dismantled assumptions. People stopped asking what was being said about you and started asking why it was being said. Motives surfaced, emotional investments became visible. The story shifted away from you and toward the behavior of those pushing it. And that's a shift no one can reverse once it begins. Because truth doesn't need urgency, it needs space. You gave it that space by not contaminating it with reaction, by not feeding it with emotion. By trusting that clarity doesn't need a spokesperson, it needs time. And this is where part one holds its breath. Because the noise hasn't fully fallen silent yet, the correction isn't complete yet, the realization is still moving through people one by one. You're still standing exactly where you were, calm, consistent, unmoved. And what happens next doesn't require your interference at all. The thing about narratives built on exaggeration is that they depend on momentum. They survive only as long as people keep pushing them forward, repeating them with conviction, feeding them with reaction. The moment that momentum slows, even slightly, the structure begins to weaken, not because anyone attacked it, but because it was never stable to begin with. You felt that slowing before anyone else named it. Conversations changed tone. Questions became quiet. The urgency that once surrounded your name started to feel forced, rehearsed, like a performance continuing after the audience had stopped clapping. People were still talking, but fewer were listening, and in that gap between sound and belief, something irreversible happened. Observation replaced assumption. People started noticing what hadn't changed. You, your routine, your demeanor, your responses, or more accurately, your lack of dramatic response while the narrative demanded escalation. You stayed level while others raised their voices. You lowered none, while exaggeration inflated itself into something almost theatrical. You remained grounded in ordinary consistency. That contrast became impossible to ignore. It's uncomfortable when reality doesn't match the story people have invested in. It creates cognitive tension. Either the story must adjust, or the observer must confront the fact that they believed something without evidence. And most people, given time and safety, choose clarity over comfort. That's why the correction didn't come as an announcement. It came as a withdrawal. People stopped repeating certain phrases, stopped forwarding certain claims, stopped reacting the way they were expected to react. The loudest accusations began echoing back into the spaces they came from, unanswered. And when exaggeration speaks to an empty room, it collapses under its own weight. You never asked for vindication. You didn't frame yourself as misunderstood. You didn't demand acknowledgement. You didn't need the narrative to flip in your favor. You needed it to run out of energy, and it did. What replaced it wasn't applause. It wasn't praise. It was something far more durable. Trust, quiet trust. The kind built not on speeches, but on pattern recognition. People realized that while stories changed, your behavior didn't. While emotions spiked and crashed around you, you stayed steady. While others relied on reaction to maintain relevance, you relied on alignment to remain intact. That's when the 600 million metaphor finally revealed itself for what it was. Not a threat, not pressure, not weight. A measurement of how much distortion was required to try to overshadow calm integrity. A number so large it exposed its own absurdity. A symbol of collective exaggeration that unintentionally proved the opposite of what it intended. Because if someone truly posed a problem, reality would show it plainly. It wouldn't need theater. People began saying things like, "It doesn't add up," and meaning it. They began revisiting earlier assumptions and noticing how quickly those assumptions had been formed. They noticed how often urgency had replaced evidence, how emotion had substituted for observation. And they noticed something else too. You never asked them to notice. That's what made the realization stick. There was no pressure to agree with you, no demand to take your side, no attempt to guide perception. You didn't recruit belief, you allowed discernment. Those who had overreacted began to feel it first. Not guilt, exactly, but discomfort, the kind that comes when someone realizes they projected instability onto a steady surface. When noise no longer has a target, it turns inward. Contradictions surfaced without being exposed. Timelines unraveled without being challenged. Claims lost coherence when repeated under calmer conditions. And slowly, almost reluctantly, the narrative lost authority. What remained was your presence, unchanged. Undramatic, unperformative. People started defending you without framing it as defense. I've never seen them act that way. That doesn't match my experience. Something feels exaggerated here. Statements like these don't escalate conflict. They dissolve it. They don't confront. They contextualize. And once context returns, distortion fades. The ones who built the story felt the shift as loss of control, not because you took anything from them, but because attention moved elsewhere. When exaggeration no longer commands focus, it loses relevance. When reaction dries up, performance ends. You didn't win. You didn't need to. Reality corrected itself because reality always does when given enough time and enough calm to breathe. What's important is not that people changed their minds. It's privately, thoughtfully, without spectacle. That kind of correction lasts. It doesn't swing wildly from one extreme to another. It settles. And that settling is where truth lives. You became something different in their perception, not because you transformed, but because they slowed down enough to see what had been there all along. Someone consistent, someone regulated, someone uninterested in manipulation or urgency, someone whose silence wasn't avoidance, but confidence in time. Time did the rest. The exaggerations faded into footnotes. The dramatic language lost its edge. The 600 million became an inside reference, almost ironic, a reminder of how inflated things had once been. What remained was the recognition that integrity doesn't need defending when it's visible. You didn't correct the distortion, you outpaced it. And now there's a quiet where there used to be noise, not emptiness resolution. The kind that doesn't need to be discussed. The kind that allows everyone to move forward without revisiting the chaos that preceded it. You didn't chase clarity. Clarity caught up to you. You didn't demand understanding. Understanding emerged on its own. You didn't fight the narrative. The narrative exhausted itself. And what's left now is simple. You're still here, still steady, still aligned. The pressure dissolved, not because it was resisted, but because it was never real enough to withstand calm observation. The exaggeration collapsed, not because it was attacked, but because it couldn't survive consistency. This isn't a victory scene, it's a return to baseline. A reminder that when integrity stays intact, distortion has an expiration date. That silence, when grounded, becomes evidence. That calm, when consistent, becomes authority without ever asking for it. You didn't need to be louder. You needed to be real. And reality, given enough time, always chooses itself.